Hello, and welcome to Dissecting Philosophy with Dr McDonald. In this episode, we're going to be reading and discussing the sections in Nietzsche's This Book, Zarathustra, of War and Warriors and of the New Idol. In the section of War and Warriors, we'll be going into the discussion about developing our own opinions and becoming warrior-like, and a wee brief discussion that accompanies that of the film Philadelphia. And for the section of the New Idols, we have quite a really critical section of Nietzsche's view of government and the state, and it's a really no-holds-barred section. And we'll have a nice discussion of the movie Fight Club that really nicely fits in with what Nietzsche wants to say there. So let's get started then. Of War and Warriors. We do not wish to be spared by our best enemies, nor by those whom we love from the very heart. So let me tell you the truth. My brothers in war, I love you from the very heart. I am and have always been your kind. I am also your best enemy. So let me tell you the truth. I know the hatred and envy of your hearts. You are not great enough not to know hatred and envy. So be great enough not to be ashamed of them. And if you cannot be saints of knowledge, at least be its warriors. They are the companions and forerunners of such sainthood. I see many soldiers, if only I could see many warriors. What they wear is called uniform. May what they conceal with it not be uniform too. You should be such men as are always looking for an enemy, for your enemy. And with some of you, there is hate at first sight. You should seek your enemy. You should wage war. You should wage your war, a war for your opinions. And if your opinion is defeated, your honesty should still cry triumph over that. You should love peace as a means to new wars, and the short peace more than the long. I exhort you not to work, but to battle. I do not exhort you to peace, but to victory. May your work be a battle, may your peace be a victory. One can be silent and still only when one has an arrow and bow. Otherwise, one babbles and quarrels. May your peace be a victory. So straight from the get-go, there's a sort of vulnerability that Nietzsche really says about us and our opinions. We don't wish to be spared by our best enemies, nor by those who we love from the very heart. So it's in that way in which you ask your partner or loved one or friend for their honest opinion, and you don't want to be spared because what you want to hear is, of course, the truth about the given situation. Am I wrong about how am I thinking about this? And of course, a good friend could always say, well, actually, I think you are wrong here because, or there's another way to think about this. And let's have a wee think about this alternative viewpoint. And so it really challenges your own bias and your own presuppositions about how you think about things. And there's that great line too that I'm also your best enemy, in the sense of even when you really uphold an individual to a really high standard, someone like Nietzsche, it's never to have that point that you hold them up to the sort of complete idolatry level. They're completely untouchable, completely perfect, but you yourself should always find a way to challenge them and try to find flaws within their own arguments as well, and to never just settle and be comfortable with that. Why not? Because what will ultimately differentiate your opinion from their opinion at that point? And it's all those little flaws and problems you say, well, actually, I don't agree with this view because, or this point because, that we then start to differentiate our own view and our own opinion from someone else's. And then from that, we start to slowly form and build our own opinions. At that point as well, Nietzsche's like, you've got to go find your enemy. You've got to find the people that you disagree with. Always have that look out for those that are conflicting with your own opinion about that. Why is that the case? Because it's a great way for you to develop your own beliefs, your own opinions, your own way of thinking about things through having that conflict. And you should never just rest upon your laurels, is the expression. So you should never get completely comfortable and set about your ways, but always be in sort of the midst of a war, he says, and a great battle, and trying to ultimately have your viewpoint win over the others. And also we've got a problem here, as it says, we see great soldiers is that point in which we have those people, he says, are great soldiers because they really love someone else's view and someone else's opinion, to the extent that all of what you get is just someone else's view and opinion coming straight back at whoever it is, but not their own view, of course. So we just have these great soldiers who all admire whoever it is. Let's say Jordan Peterson as an example. And then, of course, everybody listens to Jordan Peterson. Everybody thinks he's fabulous, fantastic. What they don't do is think critically about what he's saying. And so you just get an army of people just completely repeating whatever Jordan says verbatim. And that's not what we want, of course, that Nietzsche's saying here. What we want is a set of warriors. What we want is those people who want to go into battle, challenge, and critically think about what someone's saying, and not just completely be seduced by whoever it is that's talking. Of course, Nietzsche's just saying here as well, we're not going to be completely skeptical about absolutely everything. So don't just say, oh, come on, really? To absolutely everything. But it's that point that we tend to lose that critical edge because the point is argued for so well, or because they're such a great talker and make such great speeches that you're just so enamored with it in the first place. You think, oh, this is just too fabulous, isn't it? It's so great. Oh, this is just too good. And it's almost like reading a good book as well. When you become so engrossed in a good book, just generally don't think about all the problems that could be going on with it in a plot structure sense, or with a character development and so on. You're just like, oh, this is a fantastic story. It's the same point again. Well, you've got to think more critically about it and not just be caught up in what is exactly going on. So continuing on then, you say it is the good cause that hallows even war. I tell you, it is the good war that hallows every cause. War and courage have done more great things than charity. Not your pity, but your bravery has saved the fortunate up to now. What is good, you ask? To be brave is good. Let the little girl say, to be good is to be what is pretty, and at the same time touching. They call you heartless, but your heart is true, and I love the modesty of your kind-heartedness. You feel ashamed of your flow, whilst others feel ashamed of their ebb. Are you ugly? Very well, my brothers, take the sublime about you, the mantle of the ugly. And when your soul grows great, it grows arrogant, and there is a wickedness in your sublimity. I know you. In wickedness, the arrogant and the weak man meet, but they must understand one another. I know you. You have many enemies whom you hate, but not enemies whom you despise. You must be proud of your enemy, then the success of your enemy shall be your success too. To rebel, that shows nobility in a slave. Let your nobility show itself in obeying. Let even your commanding be in obeying. To be a good warrior, thou shalt sounds more agreeable than I will, and everything that is dear to you, you should first have commanded to you. Let your love towards life be love towards your highest hope, and let your highest hope be the highest idea of life. But you should let me commend to you your highest idea, and it is, man is something that should be overcome. Thus live your life of obedience and war. What good is long life? What warrior wants to be spared? I do not spare you. I love you from the very heart, my brothers in war. Thus spoke Zarathustra. So it's quite an interesting wee section there as well. And Nietzsche's saying you have lots of enemies whom you hate, but not enemies whom you despise. And it's that point as well, you've always got to be charitable towards a person's viewpoint that you don't agree with. And a sense of, even if you completely, utterly, from the very core of your being, absolutely, fundamentally disagree with absolutely everything they say, You still have to be charitable towards their view. You still have to say, well, isn't it good that we have such a diversity in the first place? Isn't it good that we have such a viewpoint that differs from our own in that way? Because, of course, if we get rid of all that, if we say there's only one way of thinking about things, then, of course, we run into the absolute danger of just a complete totalitarian and fascist way of thinking, and that's absolutely not what we want. And then there's that interesting point as well, to rebel that shows nobility in a slave. Let your nobility show itself in obeying. In the sense of that little bit there is saying that it's not to have that complete arrogance of you think you know best about absolutely everything, and so everybody else is going to follow exactly what you say down to the T. But it also follows back into that previous point of, well, you also want to be accepting of another person's viewpoint, and if they have something good to say, well, that's a positive thing, and it's going to be something that's going to propel you to form your opinion and belief. So you don't have to completely reject everything. You don't have to be completely narcissistic and egotistical about your own viewpoint as well. And so we've got a great point that argues for diversity, a very democratic view of things and how we should battle other viewpoints. And then towards the end, we have those little lines of arguing towards the highest idea of life. In the sense of, as well, he's saying the best opinions are always going to be life-affirming opinions against any ideality, against any sort of transcendent viewpoint. And as long as someone arguing for a very life-affirming view of things is going to be towards the right way of arguing. And also, what's really interesting as it ends off on is that man is something that should be overcome. Is again a sort of repetition from earlier as well. The whole idea of your own viewpoint is something that be overcome. And to say, well, knowledge in itself is something that's incredibly fragile, is not something that's always going to be the same. What we think now is going to always hold to be the correct way of thinking about things. But also, it said that glorious moment, it says, like, all good warriors, who wants to live forever anyway? And to say, well, if you're gonna go down, you might as well go down swinging, in the sense of you're gonna have those people that's gonna argue against you, and at times can outnumber you. But that's a fantastic thing. And there'll be those times when you'll get the upper hand and have really good points, and then there'll be other times when other people will get the one up on you. And eventually, both those viewpoints will be completely irrelevant, and it'll move on to something completely else. So everybody ultimately go down swinging in the end, regardless what you're arguing for. And to round this section off, I thought it would be a great wee idea to have a short discussion about the film Philadelphia. And here's a brief wee description about why the film's so important as well. So the film was released in 1993, and it's a couple of wee paragraphs from the website weforum.org. It can be difficult for anyone who didn't live through the start of the AIDS epidemic in the early 1980s to understand just how much stigma, fear, and misunderstanding surrounded the disease. A 1985 poll in the US found that 81% of Americans felt people living with AIDS should be placed in quarantine, and 15% thought they should be identified with tattoos. When Philadelphia was released in 1993, it helped change those perceptions. The film follows the journey of a young gay lawyer, played by Tom Hanks, who is fired by his firm after discovering that he has AIDS. It was the first Hollywood film to tackle the issue of AIDS and homophobia, and it helped destigmatize a subject that until then few people wanted to discuss. It got people talking about HIV in a way that they really weren't, because it was always that thing we didn't really want to talk about, said HIV advocate Gary Bell. And of course, what's great to relate that all into the Nietzsche as well in that section is to say, well, what is the war on that given movie is on complete misinformation in the medical sense about how AIDS works. And the general populace's understanding, because of all that misinformation, to have really horrible ideas about how people should be treated if they had the disease. And what's so great about the movie as well, it's fighting from the sort of underdog position, potentially in a minority position as well, because the general populace, or a section of the general populace, are arguing for one point. But what's so great about relating into the Nietzsche again is that it's arguing for a very much a life-affirming view of things and for the better treatment of people. And it's also saying, well, we're not going to hate the people who think that way, because of course what they've done is just understand things incorrectly, and so it's absolutely not their fault at all. In fact, if everybody then watches the movie, gets better information and so on, everybody will be able to understand exactly how it functions, and that the whole information that they did have in the first place was completely incorrect. And so it's a great example in which you can say, well, there you can have a warrior for a certain viewpoint, and then having that viewpoint ultimately result in a great massive change in how people think about things in an incredibly positive way, and help to completely destigmatize the subject altogether. Moving on to the next section then, of the new idol. There are still peoples and herds somewhere, but not with us, my brothers. Here there are states. The state. What is that? Well then, now open your ears, for I shall speak to you of the death of peoples. The state is the coldest of all cold monsters. Coldly it lies too, and this lie creeps from its mouth. I, the state, am the people. It is a lie. It was creators who created peoples and hung a faith and a love over them. Thus they served life. It is destroyers who set snares for many and call it the state. They hang a sword and 100 desires over them. So straight from the get-go, there is absolutely no holds barred. Nietzsche's coming out of the gate swinging in this section. So we have to do a little back step for a second before we get into it. So in a way, it's sort of referring to political philosophy in the sort of very basic social contract sense of it. So you get that in Hobbes and Rousseau, where in both philosophies, although they differ exactly how that social contract comes about, is ultimately that you sign away your liberty in order for someone else, namely a politician, to take control of the government decisions from you. So straight from the get-go as well, Nietzsche is ultimately saying the state is founded on the idea of taking care of the people, is meant to act in the interests of the people, but it sets the snares, as he says, and sword over the desires of them at the same time. And why is this a bad thing, of course, is that the state is going to use the people in order to serve its own means. And what exactly does all that mean? Let's continue on. Where people still exist, there the people do not understand the state, and here as the evil eye sin against custom and law. I offer you this sign. Every people speaks its own language of good and evil. Its neighbour does not understand this language. It invented this language for itself in custom and law. But the state lies in all languages of good and evil, and whatever it says, it lies, and whatever it has stolen. Everything about it is false. It bites with stolen teeth. Even its belly is false. Confusion of the language of good and evil. I offer you this sign as the sign of the state. Truly this sign indicates the will to death. Truly it beckons to the preachers of death. Many too many are born. The state was invented for the superfluous. Just see how it lures them, the many too many, how it devours them, and chews them, and re-chews them. There is nothing greater on earth than I, the regulating finger of God. Thus the monster below bellows, and not only the long-eared and the short-sighted sink to their knees. Ah, it whispers its dismal lies to you too, you great souls. Ah, it divines the abundant hearts that like to squander themselves. Yes, it divines you too, you conquerors of the old god. You grew weary in battle, and now your weariness serves the new idol. It would like to range heroes and honorable men about it, this new idol. It likes to sun itself in the sunshine of good conscience, this cold monster. It will give you everything if you worship it, this new idol. Thus, it buys for itself the lustre of your virtues and the glance of your proud eyes. It wants to use you to lure the many too many. Yes, a cunning device of hell has been devised here, a horse of death jingling with the trappings of divine honors. Yes, a death for many has been devised that glorifies itself as life. Truly, a heartfelt service to all preachers of death. And so what's interesting as well is that we have the state set up basically in opposition to individuals and their own opinions and their own thoughts and ideas about this. The state, on the other hand, doesn't have any thoughts, ideas, and opinions. What it ultimately does is lie and steal and acts as a thief of other people's opinions and completely overrides all form of diversity or conflict in order to then say whatever is the state ideology at the given time period. And it's that danger there, as he says, every country has its different language of good and evil. So some people will agree on what's good and other people's will differ in that. But when you deal with the state is going to ultimately argue that whatever it is ethically will override it by whatever political ideology that's in place at whatever given time period. That ultimately it's the people that don't even think for themselves. All what they do is just repeat state policy. Everything what they say is ultimately a lie, and to say, well, what they actually think about things is not necessarily even what they believe, but they have to say it anyway because it has to follow in with whatever the state says, the government says, and whatever their party policy is as well. And of course then what it leads into the danger of, just see how it lures the many too many. The state is born for the superfluous, is ultimately saying, don't we see the way in which governments and politicians and the state is created up in such a way that it takes advantage of everybody, and that ultimately politicians just want to get rich, and it's the sort of stereotypical big fat cat sort of image that we had in the 1960s as well here, that the sort of CEO would exploit the workers and manipulate their sort of labor power whilst they get rich off of everybody's hard work, but they ultimately just sit on their butts. Same thing here we have in relation to the state. Don't you see how basically the state is just using people in order for everybody to go towards getting more money and wanting superfluous things about it? And ultimately, if you worship that system, look at all the lovely things that you can get out of it. Look at all the goodness and sunshine and all that he says, but you know, in the terms of you can get wealth and power and so forth from all, if you just agree with whatever that's been said as state policy. So continuing on then, I call it the state where everyone good and bad is a poisonous drinker. The state where everyone good and bad loses himself. The state where universal slow suicide is called life. Just look at these superfluous people. They steal for themselves the works of inventors and treasures of the wise. They call their theft culture, and they turn everything to sickness and calamity. Just look at these superfluous people. They are always ill. They vomit their bile and call it a newspaper. They devour one another and cannot even digest themselves. Look at these superfluous people. They acquire wealth and make themselves poor with it. They desire power, and especially the lever of power, plenty of money, these impotent people. See them clamber, these nimble apes. They clamber over one another and so scuffle into the mud and the abyss. They all strive towards the throne. It is a madness they have, as if happiness sat upon the throne. Often filth sits upon the throne, and often the throne upon filth too. They all seem madmen to me, and clambering apes, and too vehement. Their idol, that cold monster, smells unpleasant to me. All of them, these idolaters, smell unpleasant to me. My brothers, do you want to suffocate in the fumes of their animal mouths and appetites? Better to break the window and leap into the open air. Avoid this bad odour. Leave the idolatry of the superfluous. Avoid this bad odour. Leave the smoke of these human sacrifices. The earth still remains free for great souls. Many places, the odour of tranquil seas blowing about them, are still empty for solitaries and solitary couples. A free life still remains for great souls. Truly, he who possesses little is so much the less possessed. Praised be moderate poverty. Only there where the state ceases does the man who is not superfluous begin. Does the song of the necessary man, the unique and irreplaceable melody begin. There where the state ceases, look there, my brothers. Do you not see it? The rainbow and the bridges to the Superman? Thus spoke Zarathustra. So again we have the point as well that the politicians and those who are in state don't think for themselves because they steal and adopt what other people think and then use that to say, well, that is part of their culture. And a great idea to think of that as well is in Maoism, where you had certain books and so forth, the big book burnings and so forth, that didn't fit into the communist ideology, and that would all be said, well, this given view of things has to be completely eradicated. But on the other hand, what we're going to do is we're going to suddenly say, well, this person, this view, this culture, this whole thing is completely now acceptable. We're going to actually adopt this and say, now this is part of exactly what we say. And of course, that's not necessarily even what whoever artist or musician and so forth even had the view of for themselves, but suddenly their view is going to be adopted by whatever party in order to use it as part of their propaganda. In the same sense of, well, all what we have in the newspapers as well, what do we have as just complete propaganda for given viewpoints as well? Can we trust the newspapers there? And if we want the politicians, what do they want? They ultimately want wealth, they all want power, and what do they want to do with all that? They ultimately want to go towards completely superfluous things, all wanting a complete idealistic lifestyle, that dream lifestyle of whatever it is at whatever given time period. At one time period, of course, it was to have 2.4 children, to be a homeowner, to look after the husband after he comes home from work, and so on. But of course then we start to get into Nietzsche's deeper points about where exactly is he wanting to go here, what exactly is he touching upon as well, is that we're touching upon a sort of deep animality within us, that the sort of animal part of us wants that comfort, but also wants to sort of rule over all the others at the same given time. But we need to get rid of all this sort of herd mentality about us, and what do we need to get towards is more, he says there. And a really interesting point, isn't it, that he says, doesn't actually moderate poverty make us so much better? Why is that the case? Because it's really saying here that when we're poor and we have basically hardly anything, isn't that so much a much more great way about thinking about things, because no longer we're thinking about superfluous things, no longer we're thinking about, do I need designer clothes or whatever house it is, or how about this luxury food and so on, because now as well in supermarkets you have like not only just one set of food, now you've got the absolute bargain basement, then you've got the normal, and then you've got the luxurious as well. It's a great example. Does everybody always need this complete superfluous existence always put to them? completely in consumer society all the time. Actually, people had, it says moderate poverty, so not obviously extreme poverty, but basically if you had only what you needed, isn't that so much great? Because you don't think about the superfluous things, you don't think about that ideality anymore. In fact, you become much happier and much more life affirming just being happy with what you have rather than thinking about what you need. So for this section as well, I thought we could have a wee brief discussion about the film Fight Club. So if you've not seen Fight Club, it's definitely an absolutely fantastic film from 1999 as well, with Brad Pitt and Edward Norton. Here's a wee quick synopsis as well from Wikipedia about the plot. So the unnamed narrator is an automobile recall specialist who is unfulfilled by his job and possessions. He finds catharsis by posing as a sufferer of testicular cancer and other afflictions in support groups, curing his insomnia. His bliss is disturbed by another imposter, Marla Singer. The two agree to split which groups they attend. On a flight home from a business trip, the narrator meets soap salesman Tyler Durden. The narrator returns home to find that his apartment has been destroyed by an explosion. Deciding against asking Marla for help, he calls Tyler and they meet at a bar. Tyler says the narrator is beholden to consumerism. In the parking lot, he asks the narrator to hit him and they begin a fist fight. The narrator moves into Tyler's home, a large dilapidated house in an industrial area. They have further fights outside the bar which attract growing crowds of men. The fights move into the bar's basement where the men form Fight Club, which routinely meets for the men to fight recreationally. So that's enough of the plot we need to go on for having a discussion about the movie. So what's so great as well, and it's so done in a cinematography way, is you get to see into the narrator's apartment, and it's everything from IKEA as well. He loves things from IKEA, so you literally get the IKEA coffee table and chairs and so forth as it all goes around, and literally have him on the phone as well, phoning up to buy things, to all be content and happy and very much this ideal little bubble that he's created for himself and his little home full of IKEA things. But really it's that given point as well, that is he really genuinely being happy here, because he's living very much a superfluous existence, just being surrounded by really this sort of ideal state of things. And then we have that whole relation into Tyler Durden as well, where Tyler Durden is the one that sort of acts as the catalyst for him to then critically engage and reflect upon everything that he's thought about in his life in a very productive way, because everything in his apartment is suddenly then lost in an explosion, and he goes in to live with Tyler, and what is Tyler's place is just this big dilapidated house that's there and completely abandoned, and is a complete utter total mess. Like the taps are running dirty water, there's leaky roofs, literally dripping water everywhere and so on. But he seems to be more content there, more happier with that, rather than in his superfluous existence. Which in and of itself is quite a weird thing to think about, in a way, that he's more happier in a complete crap hole than in his nice little apartment. Why is that the case? What exactly is going on? Because in one way as well, it fits into the whole thing about not really having your own viewpoint about things and just going with whatever is told to you to go to get to be happy, be whatever that is. Go drink alcohol sociably on a Friday or a Saturday night. That's what's to be expected of you to be a happy, normal, functioning individual, is to have a side problem of alcoholism potentially, or that you've got to go and purchase these items, because if you do, then suddenly purchasing these specific items will make you happier than if you don't purchase the items. Which, as well as it's great, if you read the bottles in detail as well, it all talks about how good it's going to make you feel and how much happier you're going to be just by using whatever it is, even if it's just something as simple as a shampoo. There's a great advertisement as well quite a number of years ago called Herbal Essences, and it was women in this orgasmic state, literally in the advertisements as well, in this almost sexual state, and you're thinking, what what in the world is going on here? You know, because this is at normal times of day watching telly. You could think of we children watching it going, Mum, what's the woman doing in the shower? But then you think, oh, maybe actually if I buy herbal essence or shampoo, I can have an orgasmic experience as well. That'll make my day go much better if I suddenly just rub a wee bit of that into my hair. And that's precisely the point. That's where they get you, of course, is to say, well, actually, this is going to make you happier if you have it than if you don't have it. And that's the critical point we have in Fight Club as well, to say, well, really, am I going to really be that happy just by purchasing this as an item at all? And it's through that critical reflection as well, and that engagement, that we then say, well, actually, what you tell me is a load of crap, isn't it? If I buy that, I'm not going to be any happier before than I am now. And then also what happens in Fight Club is that he starts to develop his own idea about what he thinks, and he starts to develop his own idea about what it is to be happy outside of that bubble. So no longer having somebody tell you you have to go purchase these things, he's going to go and say, well, actually, no, I'm going to go live my life this way. And this is making him much more content than adhering to what's expected of him. And that's the given point that Nietzsche is also saying here as well, is that don't we see the period that he has in the film where he's in poverty? Not only is he able to critically reflect upon consumerism, but he's also able to develop as an individual and develop his own ideas and thoughts in such a much more productive and positive way than in the previous sense, where everything was already told to him and he just accepted everything at face value. And really we could see that point as well, in which Tyler Durden acts as that catalyst. And of course at the end of the film, slight bit of a spoiler, he gets rid of Tyler Durden at the end. Why is that necessary? Because he no longer needs Tyler Durden in his life anymore, in a sense, because he has developed as a person. By the point you come full circle to the end again, and he has developed his own ideas and his own way of thinking, so he doesn't need Tyler anymore. Thank you very much for listening to the episode. I hope you enjoyed my discussion of the sections of War and Warriors and of The New Idol. Feel free to drop me a wee email at my address dissectingphilosophy@gmail.com, and I can be also found on Twitter at @IamARubberman. Thank you very much for listening, and I hope you join us next time.